And let me add my welcome and my thanks to you for braving the cold. And I have, this is my first year of snow tires, I have to admit. I have never done that before, but my tires were at a state where I had to do something. So I decided to do snow tires. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Especially when you're driving, yeah, it's just pretty awesome. And you've probably been outside, you've probably been shoveling snow, you've probably been doing that work as well. It's some of these things are hard and they remind us that work is not always easy. But I want to ask you, what's the worst job that you ever had? It would take some time. I think if we were to go around the room, I think we'd find some pretty interesting stories, wouldn't we? Of places where you were working, where you just kind of look back and you say, wow, that was absolutely terrible. And the interesting thing something that I find interesting is that what is a terrible job for me may not actually be a terrible job for you. The fact that we're all different and we all have different experiences and backgrounds means that your terrible job might be my dream job, and my dream job might be your worst job ever. I can remember being a greeter over Christmas at a store. In fact, this actually wasn't my worst job because, believe it or not, I actually like to talk to people. Even at a time of year when people are not all that fun to talk to, like Christmas. And so I was in a store, and for those of you who don't know, that's where you used to go to get Christmas presents, before we did that online. But so at this place, everybody had name tags, and I had a name tag, and my name tag said greeter. In other words, that said, don't ask me any questions, I'm just here to say hello, right? And that just, made sure everybody was on the same page. And so one of those times I had done my job, I had welcomed someone very fondly, really, into the store. I nailed it, it was awesome. And they walked past me, and eventually they started talking to a sales rep. And the sales rep said to them, oh, well, that's, I was talking to Geeter over there, and he told me that where I need to go is come talk to you. And so, anyways, the name tag didn't go over so well. But here's the thing. The funny thing is that the person who they were talking to, the sales rep, didn't correct her at all. Just said, okay, and went on to call me Geeter for the rest of the time that I was here, which is great. But it wasn't my worst job. My worst job was probably when I worked at Tim Hortons. Not because Tim Hortons is a job that is not worth doing or is not a good place. It was because of the boss that I had where I worked. I worked in a place where this boss was always just kind of showing up at just the wrong time. So I was serving in the drive-thru, and I used to get into the drive-thru because I was usually quick at getting people through, but I had my own way of doing it, right? And so as people were making these orders, I was kind of making them up and I was getting them set up, and so I'd go and I'd have this sort of rhythm, and I'd go to the window and I'd enter the order and everything would be fine. But what would happen is when things got busy, my boss, or the owner of the store, she would come over and she would say, hey, what's going on? And she'd start moving everything around and kind of doing everything like that. And so here I am, now I'm completely lost. In every car that comes to the drive-thru, I'm saying, yeah, what did you order again? So they're yelling at me, she's yelling at me, like usually in front of the customers, because that's what she did as well. And so this was a place where I just found it so difficult to do the things that that I had in front of me. It was hard. It was difficult. It was a struggle. It was excruciating at times. And in fact, I endured my time at Tim Hortons. That's the way I would describe it. But in the end, I don't think I would even really blame my boss, because I'm not sure if I would have done it differently. I mean, I was some kid who thought he knew what he was talking about, and I'm sure I didn't. But time came and I'd go home and I'd just be completely frustrated. I don't know if you've ever been in one of those places where that's been your experience with work, but I came across a statement this week that described work as hating and waiting. Have you ever heard that? It seems a little harsh, maybe a little dark. You ever felt like that? Ever felt like work is just hating and waiting? I know I felt that way before. Last week we started a series and we kind of got into this idea of work. And we talked about, right from the beginning, what is the foundation of what we do? And we talked about this idea that God is a God who works. And that He created a world to need work. And so right from the beginning, work was a part of God's plan. It's part of the whole story of what God was creating. And so what we can see as we look back at the foundations, these first few chapters of our Bibles, we can see that work was created in this amazing way. And it's incredible. It's an opportunity. It can bring purpose. It allows us to fulfill who we are as we're made in the image of God. And this is all great news. Except it's not the end of the story, is it? The story continues on. See, last week I hope that you didn't leave here feeling that we can talk in these glowing, idealistic terms about work. We can talk about how great it is, but then you may have been sitting here and thinking, well, you don't actually work in my office. You don't actually understand what it's like for me to go into work on Monday morning. Or maybe instead you were here last week and you said to yourself, okay, I'm going to take a different perspective when it comes to my work. I'm going to try to love Mondays, and I'm going to go in with this new idea, and I'm going to be passionate about what I do. And then all of a sudden your boss comes in and dumps on you. Not because you did something wrong, but because they're having a bad day. Or maybe you get to a place where, that product that you've been working on forever has been scooped by another company. Or you end up at school and you've got a test to do and you just fail it miserably. You see, all this kind of points to this bigger idea that work is hard. What we do is difficult. What we do is actually a little distorted, and it can easily get us frustrated. You see, when God sat back and he looked at creation and he said, yeah, this is good, he included work. So how is it that when God looks at work and said, this is what it should be, and then we actually realize what our actual experience is, how do we kind of bring those two together? Because maybe for some of us, work is a grind at best. Maybe for some of us, you wish you were doing something else. Maybe you wish you were using your skills more in the place where you're employed. Maybe you want to work, but you've been having difficulty finding something. Maybe you've been trying to make friends with the neighbor. You've been trying to kind of, build into that relationship, and nothing seems to be working. And so if the title of our series suggests that we were actually made for Mondays or made for work, then does that mean that I was made to be yelled at by my kids or my boss? Was I really made to deal with demanding customers? Was I really made to pick a side in whatever office politics seemed to be flowing around the office? And here's the thing, because right after, when God sat back and said, yep, this is good, right after that, everything very quickly unraveled. And what happened is God's good creation was distorted by sin. And what we know as we read through this account is that Adam and Eve wanted things their own way. They wanted to be their own gods, and pride began to kind of seep into their lives in a way that led them to act completely opposite to the way that God wanted them to. And as a result, we see something that we often refer to as the fall. This is the moment where humans kind of stepped up and said, I'm going to take charge. I'm going to do things my way. But that, which we call sin, has consequences. You see, when we choose to walk away, at that moment, what happened is that there was consequences for our sin, including death, including a separation from God. But see, the thing is that sin didn't just have consequences for us personally. It didn't just have consequences for us spiritually. Sin impacted the entire created world. Sin corrupts good work. Sin is the answer to why God sat back and said, yeah, this is good, and then we have the experiences that maybe we did even just this last week. So in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, God lays out the consequences of their action. In Genesis chapter 3, here's what he says. To the woman he said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Scholars actually debate this particular phrase, what's meant by what's said here. But what we can all agree on is that what was being represented here is that sin created misunderstanding and frustration and conflict in our marriage relationships. So relationships were impacted, and so was childbirth. It was affected. But God continues, and he turns to Adam and he says, because you listened to your wife and you ate the fruit from the tree which I have commanded you, that you must not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your brow. You will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, and for dust you will return. You see, your work will be hard. And as a gardener, what was being told to Adam is that he would have to work around thorns and thistles in order to put food on the table. Everything was going to sort of be raised up when it came to the frustration level of our work. See, the temptation in our lives is to separate the spiritual from the non-spiritual into these two different and distinct categories. But the truth is, there are no distinct categories. Often we get to this idea where we think, sin is something that affects me spiritually, it affects me personally, it separates me from God. It's something that affects the spiritual realm of my life. But what we see in this passage is that sin actually affected everything. It affected our jobs, it affected creation, it affected everything, and began to distort it from the very beginning. These two places that we were meant to find pleasure in, love and work, are distorted so clearly right from the very beginning. And so last week we talked about thinking about Mondays in a new way, and that is incredibly important, but we cannot expect things to work out the way that we plan. Things will not be easy because God made it clear that work would be excruciating and difficult at times. And so it is. And work was distorted in a couple of different ways. There were the thorns that come up, and those are the things that are outside of our control. Those things that kind of, that come into our environment. Perhaps it's that time where you've been just working as hard as you can to get that promotion, and then all of a sudden the nephew of the boss shows up and they get promoted ahead of you. Or maybe you get cheated, or the product that you've been working on is a failure. And it's a failure not because of something that you've done, but because of the market and the environment in which you're bringing this to market. All of a sudden, these are the kind of thorny things, those thistles, things that come at us. But then there's another way that work corrupts us as well. The other way that work is corrupted is actually sitting right here in our pews. The reason that work is corrupted is actually you. As much as you feel like you want to blame others and we, kind of are frustrated by our work because it's everybody else's fault, we also need to recognize that sin's impacted us. And we take that into our places of work. And so we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that sometimes work can be described as hating and waiting rather than an opportunity or a gift. And this is actually made even more clear perhaps in a book of the Bible called Ecclesiastes. This is a book that describes meaningless in life. And we don't actually know for sure whether the writer was Solomon or someone else, but there's a bit of a universal feel to this entire book. The author thinks about things that might make someone happy and fulfilled, and he begins to describe how each one of those things is meaningless on their own. He talks about wisdom and the pursuit of understanding and education, and he shows that in the end all of this will just not fulfill us, not bring us the happiness that we're looking for in our life. And then he describes the idea of pleasure, and he begins to say, well, maybe pleasure is the possible answer. Maybe I'll just get all the things that I want, and maybe I'll just live the way that I want, and everything will be fine. But what he recognizes is that even that is meaningless. It just doesn't provide the way that we think it might. And then he turns to work. And this is the third of the three things that he mentions at the beginning of this book. And he looks at his own achievements, and he looks at all of the things that he's done and the things that he's accomplished, and he wonders, is there a point to any of this? Here's what he says in verse 17 of chapter 2. He says, "So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated the things that I toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish? Yet they will have control over all the fruit into which my toil, into which I poured my efforts and my skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun." Okay, so this is in total contrast, right, to what we talked about last week. He's practically just kind of shouting, is all of this meaningless? Seriously, the things that I create, I'm just giving them to someone else anyways. What's the point? There's a guy who hated Mondays. He says, I hate the things that I've worked for because I'm going to pass them off to someone else. They're going to take on my life's work anyways. And whether it's a short time or a long time, all of my accomplishments are just going to fade away. So here's the thing, if what we talked about last week, that work began as something good, if that is true, and what we understand as well is that work continues to be distorted by sin, is there any way to kind of bring things back? Is there any way to reconcile those ideas? At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, here's what the teacher says. It says, "This is what I observe to be good, that it's appropriate for a person to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun in the days that God has given them, because that is their lot. And so in some ways, the author of Ecclesiastes says that yes, all of this looks absolutely meaningless and it's hard to find a way through, but he observed in the end that there is a way for us to find joy even in that labor that's hard. He says that even the sleep of a laborer is sweet, which means there's hope for work. Not to mention the many places in the New Testament where work is described in all these glowing terms. So what can we do to redeem work? How do we make that something that we can find joy in? How do we find meaning in it? And today I want to talk about this tension that we have between making work great even when it's not great. That's what redeeming looks like. I want to suggest that we can infuse our work with meaning. No matter what you do, no matter what your job, no matter what you're headed for on Monday, each one of us can infuse our work with meaning by being intentional. And so just for a moment, if I were to ask you that question, if you were to think, okay, so what is it that I can do to infuse my work with meaning? What do you think about when you think about that? What comes to mind when you start thinking, okay, what do I do to make my work really matter? See, I'm guessing that some of us, as you're thinking, are probably tempted to start thinking that, well, if I take the money, if I work for this money and all what I earn, I give to the church or I give to something that is quote unquote important, then I can make my work meaningful. Or you might be thinking, well, if I continue to work for justice in the world and I serve the orphans and the widows in another part of the world, or if I am doing something that is important, that will redeem my work. And maybe you're thinking, I need to move into a different place of work where I can find that kind of fulfillment. Here's the thing, none of those things are essentially or entirely bad. I mean, being generous and practicing compassion are necessary as followers of Jesus. But redeeming our work does not mean that we take whatever we do and make it spiritual. Because there is no spiritual and non-spiritual. It is all important. And I hope that we begin to understand this as we've been working through this. No matter what you are doing on Monday, it's all important and significant and part of what God's doing in the world. So how do we begin to redeem it? Well, Timothy Keller, in the book that we've been looking at for this series, his book entitled Every Good Endeavor, talks about a new compass for work. He talks about these guiding principles that followers of Jesus can use to infuse meaning into what they're doing. And let me just kind of go through a few of these. You see, first, I think we infuse our work with meaning when we work with a different source for guidance. It's true that we have a type of handbook in our hands, this Bible, but the Bible is not simply a list of rules and do's and don'ts. You will not find in here which job to take. You will not find the answer to those questions about when do I speak up in a meeting or when do I not speak up in a meeting. Some of these things are very specific. Things that we deal with every day are not going to be found, in chapter and verse. Instead, what we find in here is something very different. What we find is wisdom. It goes along with that kind of guidebook idea. In Ephesians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul writes, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise." You see, so wisdom is how we begin to allow God's direction to change the way we do things in our places of work. My car has an owner's manual, and if I read it, I think that my car will do better. But here's the thing, there are lots of things that are in the owner's manual that I may not do all the time. It takes me a little longer maybe to rotate the tires, or maybe I stretch a few extra 100 kilometers every time I need to get my oil changed. And the thing is that if I choose to do other things outside of what's in the owner's manual, no one's going to write me a ticket, no one's going to get me in trouble because I'm kind of missing the mark, but here's what happens. My car's not going to work all that well, is it? And so when we think about the way that this book provides wisdom for us, what we can understand is that as we allow this book to permeate our lives, as we allow what we know about God to change our actions and the way we approach the world, it begins to line us up with God's guidebook or owner's manual for life. And all of a sudden we find ourselves in places where our work and our school start to make more sense because we're finding wisdom in the things that God has has told us and the things that God has revealed to us. You see, wisdom comes when we know God personally, when we begin to understand ourselves better, and when we gain experience in living this way. And these are things that we need to do as we allow this book to permeate our lives. So maybe for you, the next step is actually really simple. Maybe the next step for you this week is to get to know the owner's manual. Maybe you're in the middle of something at work and you've got some questions about exactly how to proceed. Perhaps you need to bring someone around you who can help you look at what God says about life and about the way that you can understand yourself and the world you live in, and help you make decisions about where you're moving next. Get to know the owner's manual so you can develop that wisdom. And second, we infuse work with meaning when we work with a different view of humanity. And I think this is a really important one, and a place where Christianity has made an incredible difference in the world around us in a positive way. To the ancient Greeks and the Romans, your value was tied up in what you were able to accomplish, period. That's what made you, you. But as Christians, we believe very strongly, we talked about this last week, that we were all created in the image of God. And that means every single one of us. And this has literally changed the world in terms of human rights. It has raised the profile of children. It has raised the profile of those who don't fit in some other way. And so when you're in the lunchroom and the conversation begins to shift towards criticism of coworkers, how do you respond? When you're in the schoolyard and you're hearing about things that are going on with someone else and the conversation turns really negative, how do you respond? When someone's being unfair or mean, I've worked with my share of difficult people. But if everyone is made in God's image, then they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. When we see people the way God sees people, something actually very fascinating happens. Number one, I'm not surprised at brokenness. I'm not surprised when people act inappropriately. I expect it. How many people have had those experiences where you're talking together and people do one of those like, oh, have you heard what that person did? Isn't that crazy? See, as believers, we should expect people to act inappropriately, which allows us to see people for who they are and begin to treat them with respect. I also see people as people, and I know that sounds obvious, but in our work, we tend to see people in all kinds of other ways. We may see people in our places of work like obstacles or competition, or potential clients when we talk about customers, or perhaps we see other people as machinery to accomplish what we're setting out to do. See, this should change the way that we talk about other people. It should change the way we try to act with other people. For those of us who own businesses or manage teams, we recognize that layoffs are part of work, and there are times when people need to be let go. But we can also still treat people with dignity, and this adds meaning. This begins to infuse what we're doing with meaning. I remember working at a store where I was encouraged to upsell from one product to another. And let me tell you, there's nothing wrong with that kind of tactic, because oftentimes people can get even more from whatever product they're looking for if they move to that other product. And so there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But here's where it becomes different. As Christians, when we begin to see people as potential marks to help us meet a quota or to reach some kind of goal that we've set for ourselves, that's when we begin to recognize that we are seeing the world differently. We're seeing humanity differently than the way that God sees humanity. See, this is the way that this begins to change us, and we can infuse our work with meaning. Third, we can infuse our work with meaning when we work from a different set of virtues. And listen, I recognize that I think we all know that integrity is important. We need to be working with high ethical standards. But it's not just simply about ethics. Many business leaders in North America understand that honesty is good for business. It's good for the bottom line. Ultimately, if you were dishonest, it's going to catch up to you. Now, this is something that we've seen play out in business in our world. And so we can cheer on colleagues who act with integrity even when their motivation is the bottom line. This is a good thing. They're working according to the owner's manual, and so it works when they begin to get in line. But as followers of Jesus, we're not just called to high ethical standards. We're actually called to standards of virtues that are even go above and beyond morality, go above and beyond just being a nice person. We're called to virtues like perseverance and excellence, We're called to ideas that, like faith and hope, and most importantly, we're called to love. In 1 John 4:7 it says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God." And listen, some of you are working to influence where God has you, and perhaps that's in a senior's home, maybe it's on a staff in a large corporation. But being that kind of influence is difficult. It's hard. It will often be frustrating. But when we operate from this foundation of love, this goes beyond just doing the right thing. It means loving people who are hardest to love. It means serving others whatever the cost. And this goes a long way because we stand out in a place when we begin to contribute to what God is doing as He fills the space that we find ourselves in through you and me. So what does it look like? I remember I worked with a woman at that same Tim Hortons where I started. She was unique. She was unique because she was loved by absolutely everybody who came into the store. There were people who came just to talk to her, just to have a conversation. People who wouldn't just go through the drive-thru would actually come into the store because she was so compelling. And here's what it was. She loved people. She was acting in accordance with the guidebook, with the owner's manual, and I'm not even sure if she was a Christian. But love is our calling to others. You see, she had a positive attitude. She knew people who came through her doors. She knew their names. She recognized people. She knew their orders. She loved them. She cared for them. She asked questions. And guess what? Her positive attitude also was good for business too. See, finally, we infuse meaning into our work when we work for a different audience. And perhaps this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways. Our motivation for work might just be the best way to infuse meaning into what we do. Our motivation needs to be upward to God. When we recognize that what we do matters, when we realize that ultimately we are continuing God's work, it can change our focus on what we were doing in a dramatic way. In Ephesians chapter 6, Paul was speaking to those who were slaves, and he was speaking to those who were masters. And he laid out something that helps us not to fall into the trap of seeing work as just a necessary evil or drudgery or something that we just have to endure. But it also helps us fall into the trap of not finding our identity in our work and putting too much pressure onto the things that we do and the things that we accomplish. And what he said in verse 7 is he said, "Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving for the Lord, not people." As he was talking to the slaves, he was saying that serve them with everything, wholeheartedly. I don't know if you ever worked with someone who turned it on when the boss came into the room. All of a sudden they're moving a little faster, they're doing things a little more dramatically, making sure everybody sees whatever they're doing, become a little more energetic. I know it's cliche, but the idea that our boss is always watching should change the way that we work. Wholeheartedly. Whether it's a good day or a bad day. Whether our boss is fair or not fair. Wholeheartedly. It means working with integrity. It means working full of the virtues that we talked about. It means serving God. Now, this is not to suggest to you that you don't have to listen to your boss or do what he tells you. My pastor says, "I'm not serving you, I work for God." I'm not asking anybody to do that this week. We serve God best when we honor our bosses. We serve God best when we act with integrity, when we live out the virtues that have been described for us in the owner's manual. Listen, we are motivated by an audience of one. And maybe you're retired today, and if you're in that space, maybe it's easier for you to get this idea that you don't have to work for someone else in terms of those your bosses. Maybe the days of trying to please a boss are far behind you. You're not meeting a quota anymore. But I think even for those of us who are retired, there may be a temptation to want others to recognize you. Maybe a better way for us to look at this is that who are we trying to impress? How many likes are you looking for? Instead, Paul reminds the church to serve for an audience of one. And when we do that, we begin to infuse even work that's hard, even work that's broken, with meaning. Now, I think for many of us, there are times, and maybe lots of times, when we feel like work is hating and waiting, rather than the ideal. And the writer of Ecclesiastes, it seemed like he had lost hope. But it is possible to make great work, even when work isn't all that great. What will it look like for you this week? What will that look like for you? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for encouraging us to serve well, to work with integrity, to work wholeheartedly. God, I pray that even this week, no matter what difficulty we're heading towards as we leave this building, I pray, God, that you would just give us the courage that we need to live out our lives in a way that honors you, and to live out our work in a way that glorifies that we have been made in your image. God, we thank you for our opportunities, the opportunities that come week after week, each Monday that rolls around. And we pray for this week in the powerful name of Jesus.